Hello everybody, welcome to NEET Crash Course Biology. Now we will go through a synopsis of the chapter Mineral Nutrition. So a nutrient is the structural and the functional substance which is required for all living organisms. Mostly these mineral nutrients are inorganic material that obviously the plants obtain from the soil. Plants have to absorb these mineral nutrition, they have to utilize them, they have to assimilate these organic substances for synthesis of various raw material that is required for their growth and reproduction and development. Now, it was first demonstrated by a German botanist called Julius von Sachs in the year 1860 that it is possible to grow plants in a completely soilless condition. So this kind of a growing of plant in a completely soil-free condition in actually complete mineral solution. You are growing it only in water, which requires purified water and mineral nutrient salts, is referred to as hydroponics. So this was first experimented by Julian von Sachs, and later it was found that it is possible to grow plants in a soil-free condition. This technique has now been used in the commercial production of plants and vegetables like, for example, tomato, seedless cucumber and lettuce. It is very important to note that it is not just placing the root or placing the plant in a nutrient solution. You have to ensure that it is constantly aerated. And by varying the concentration of elements, you can study. Now, for example, if you want to study the deficiency of iron, you make sure that the nutrient solution that you are providing to the plant does not have iron in it, and then you can study what are the symptoms which the plant exhibits when there is deficiency of iron in the mineral solution. So this is very important in terms of experimenting, because by growing it in a nutrient solution you can alter the constituency, the composition of the nutrient solution, and you can study what are the different types of symptoms, the deficiency symptoms that are observed in the plant if a particular mineral nutrient is missing in the nutrient solution. Now, what are essential elements? Now, essential elements are those which are very much essential, as the name itself indicates, for the growth, for the survival, for the reproduction, for, say, the seed setting of the plant. Okay, surprisingly, in some plants we can also find selenium, gold and strontium as plants which are growing near nuclear test sites. More than 60 different elements of the total 105 that have been discovered so far have been known to be be found in plants. That is, plants take them up actively or passively from the soil, and therefore they may be considered as essential mineral elements. Criteria for essentiality. When do you consider an element as essential in the plant life? It should be absolutely essential. It should support normal growth and development. Suppose that element is not there in the soil, then the plant should not be able to grow. Its reproduction should also be affected. Its requirement must be very specific. Now, it's not like there is no a particular nutrient is not there, then the second nutrient can take its place. No, you cannot supplement the missing nutrient, or you can say that another nutrient cannot substitute for the missing nutrient. That means the requirement is highly specific, and it is not replaceable, or it is not substituted, or it cannot be compensated by some other element. And very importantly, whichever element that we are considering as essential, that element must be directly involved in the metabolic pathway of the plants. Based on the criteria, elements can be classified into macronutrients and micronutrients. So now you know what are essential elements, or the criteria on the basis of which you call it as essential element. Yes. So what is the criteria? It should be essential for growth and reproduction. Its need should be specific. It cannot be compensated or substituted by another element. The absence of one cannot be compensated by some other element, and it should be directly involved in metabolic pathways. Now let us see the classification of macronutrients and micronutrients. What are macronutrients? Now these are required in large amounts to the tune of 10 millimole per kg of dry matter of the plant. So they are required in concentrations of 10 millimole per kg of dry matter. Then we call them as macronutrients. Some of the major macronutrients are mentioned here: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, etc. These are an integral part of the complex organic molecules which are found in the plant body. Those elements which are found in quantities inside the plant body less than 10 millimole per kg of dry weight, we call them as micronutrients or microelements. Like for example, you have iron, you have boron, magnesium, copper, zinc, molybdenum, etc. Now, physiological role of some of the important elements that you should know: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are involved in general metabolism of the plant body. Nitrogen is very, very important for meristematic tissue. It's important to note here, it is very, very important for the actively growing, that is meristematic tissue. And most importantly, nitrogen is a component of proteins, nucleic acids, vitamins, coenzymes, as well as ATP. If a plant is suffering from nitrogen deficiency, it will suffer from yellowing, that is called chlorosis. There is stunted growth, there is delayed flowering. You can write that stunted growth is there. There is delayed flowering in case of nitrogen. And as it is mentioned, there is reduction in the flowering, that is delayed flowering. And one more important thing is the stem axis as well as the leaf stalk, that is the petiole, as well as the undersurface of the leaf, all of them will turn purple in color, that is they develop a kind of anthocyanin pigmentation. Okay, delayed flowering. And one more important thing associated with nitrogen is premature leaf fall. So the leaf undergo abscission very early in stage. Phosphorus. Now, phosphorus is a very important component of the plasma membrane. You know that the phosphorus is a component of phospholipid that makes up the plasma membrane. It is also components of coenzymes. It is components of proteins and nucleic acids and nucleotides. And very importantly, phosphorus is involved in phosphorylation reaction. Phosphorylation reaction, for example, if you want to produce ATP from ADP, then you have to add a phosphate in it. So this is a reaction where you have added phosphate to the substrate. This is called phosphorylation. The deficiency symptoms are very similar to nitrogen. It also leads to stunted growth, delay in flowering, and then premature leaf fall, like I already mentioned in the case of nitrogen. And most importantly, rather than leaf fall, one has to remember that in phosphorus there is premature bud fall. Okay, and also there are spots that appear on the leaf and on the stem which may be purple to reddish orange in color, that is anthocyanin spots will start appearing. Premature bud fall is there, and necrosis of the leaf, mostly in both nitrogen and phosphorus. If the leaf shows chlorosis and necrosis, it mostly starts with the older leaf and not with the younger leaf. Potassium, that is K, is very, very important. Again, potassium is extremely necessary for meristematic tissue. Potassium is essential for protein synthesis. Potassium is responsible for maintaining the anion, the cation balance in the cell. It is required for the stomatal movement. It maintains turgidity of the cell. See? In stomatal movement, it maintains the turgidity of the cell. And if there is deficiency of potassium, again there will be mottled, that means spots start appearing, mosaic appearance of yellow colored spots along with green colored regions in the leaf. There is shortening of internodes. Sometimes the plants become bushy in habitat. There is loss of apical dominance. You all know what is apical dominance. So the stem apical meristem starts dying, or it starts losing its dominance. So the plant becomes very, very bushy. Instead of growing lengthwise, it starts growing sideways. And then all the plastids, that is the chloroplast, will undergo disintegration. So plastid disintegration is one of the important features of potassium. And one more important deficiency symptom is increased rate of respiration. So the respiratory rate goes out of control. So rate of respiration becomes very, very high in a plant that is suffering from deficiency of potassium. So like I told you, potassium is seen in meristematic region, stomatal movement. It is maintaining the anionic and the cationic balance, okay, in maintenance of anionic and cationic balance. And then I told you potassium is very, very important for protein synthesis. It's a very important element for protein synthesis. And lastly, it maintains the turgor pressure in the cells, and that turgor pressure is what is responsible for driving the movement of the guard cells involved in stomatal movement. Then sulfur. Sulfur is a constituent of thymine. Sulfur is a constituent of vitamins such as thymine and biotin and some of the enzymes like coenzyme. It is also a constituent of amino acid, that is cysteine, isn't it? So there are amino acids which contain sulfur. Along with cysteine, there is one more amino acid that is very, very important. It is methionine. So cysteine and methionine contain sulfur in them. If a plant has decreased sulfur, what are the most important symptoms that are visible? Again, chlorosis happens. Now, why chlorosis is seen in younger leaves is because sulfur is not easily mobilized, or broken down easily in older leaves. So whatever sulfur is present in the older leaves, it remains in the older leaf, because sulfur and calcium, actually both of them are immobile. They are components of the structure of the cell, and so they cannot move, they cannot get broken down, they cannot be transported to all the other plants, to all the other plant parts. So if there is a deficiency, the sufferers will be the younger parts of the plant, because usually what happens when there is deficiency, all the elements are broken down. Compounds containing the elements are broken down in the older parts, and they are sent as an emergency, they are sent to the growing or the younger parts, which does not happen in the case of sulfur. That's why you see chlorosis not of the older leaves, you see chlorosis of the younger leaves. Even in case of sulfur, you all have to remember that there is appearance of purple colored pigmentation, that is anthocyanin pigmentation is very common in case of sulfur, and also the growth of the plant is severely affected. Magnesium. Now magnesium is absorbed as Mg2 plus ion. Very, very important component of part of magnesium is it is a coenzyme for enzymes involved in respiration and photosynthesis. Especially it acts as an activator for enzymes that play a very important role in activation of, it acts as an activator of important enzymes involved in carbon dioxide fixation like phosphoenol pyruvate, pepcase, that is carboxylase, and ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase oxidase, that is actually it is called the Rubisco enzyme. Another important thing about magnesium is a part of chlorophyll molecule. It is also involved in maintaining, magnesium is responsible for maintaining the ribosome structure, and you know that the ribosome is very, very important in protein synthesis. So it maintains the ribosome structure. If there is deficiency of magnesium, there is premature leaf fall, very similar to phosphorus where we had seen, okay, sorry, not phosphorus, very similar to nitrogen. There is premature leaf fall in case of those plants which suffer from phosphorus deficiency. Again, there is anthocyanin deposition and necrotic patches. In case of magnesium, the necrosis starts with older leaves, because all the phosphorus all the magnesium, if there is deficiency, it is broken down in the older leaves and it is sent as an emergency to the younger and the growing parts of the plant. So the first ones to bear the brunt are the older leaves in this particular case. Then calcium, a very important nutrient. Calcium is a part of cell wall. It is a part of middle lamella in the form of calcium pectate. It also maintains the functioning of the plasma membrane. It helps in mitosis. How does it helps in mitosis? It is very, very important for the formation of the spindle apparatus. So it maintains the spindle apparatus or helps in the spindle formation, which has a direct consequence on the process of cell division, which is nothing but the mitosis. Like I said, it regulates the functioning of the plasma membrane. It is a constituent of the cell wall as well as the middle lamella. Just like sulfur, calcium is also immobile. Once it is present in the cell, it becomes a structural part of the cell. It is immobile. So if a plant is suffering from deficiency of calcium, the older tissues cannot mobilize them and cannot send them to the younger tissues. So the most ones which exhibit curling and necrosis, you mostly see curling and necrosis in calcium deficiency, not in the older leaves but in the case of younger leaves, because calcium is immobile. The biomolecule is a part of biomolecules that make up the cell structure. It is not quickly mobilized. It is not sent to the younger growing parts of the plant. So the younger ones are the ones which bear the brunt, and they are the ones which are severely affected. Okay, so chlorosis, as I said, chlorosis happens in mostly in the case of the younger leaves. And here also there is carbohydrate metabolism is affected, because calcium also plays a very important role as coenzyme and activator of several enzymes which are involved in metabolic pathways. So because if there is no calcium, enzymes cannot do their job properly, and therefore carbohydrate metabolism is severely affected. Iron is a constituent of electron carriers, and iron is required for activation of an enzyme called catalases and peroxidases, and they are electron carriers which are referred to as the cytochrome. Now iron, if there is deficiency of iron, there is intravenal chlorosis, that is between the veins. Other than only the vein region appears to be green, otherwise the rest of the leaf appears to be yellow. It also impairs aerobic respiration, because iron is a part of the electron transport chain in aerobic respiration. Boron is involved in uptake and utilization of, it's missing here, calcium. So it is very important for the uptake and utilization of calcium. No wonder it has a role to play in maintaining the cell membrane function, because calcium also has a role to play in maintaining the cell membrane function. Boron is responsible for germination of the pollen tube in the stigma and transport of sugars or carbohydrates in the phloem tissue. You all know that the translocation of carbohydrates mostly happens in the phloem tissue. So translocation happening in the phloem, and also it plays a very important role in root growth and formation of flower. So pollen germination, maintenance of cell membrane, carbohydrate translocation in the phloem tissue, all this is the function of boron. Several diseases are seen in plants suffering from boron deficiency. Brown heart rot is seen in beetroot or sugar beet. Then corky core is seen in case of apple, and premature fall of fruits and flowers is also seen in the case of some of the plants. And also you can also see that there is a brown heart of turnip also is one of the deficiency syndrome. The central core becomes brown and it starts decaying, and that is referred to as the heart rot disease, which is not only seen in beetroot but it is also seen in turnip. Okay. Manganese, very important. Manganese is involved in, again, activating enzymes, especially it involves activation of enzymes such as carboxylases. Okay. And manganese is has a very important role in water splitting, isn't it? Now during photosynthesis, water gets split, in the presence of sunlight, and this is what releases oxygen. So water splitting process which happens during photosynthesis is because of manganese. Some of the diseases are the gray spot disease in case of oats, where spots which are where the death of tissue is seen, that is necrotic spots, and yellowing nature of the leaf starts appearing. Copper is a very important component of electron transport chain. We had seen that there are cytochromes and ferredoxin. Now cytochromes contain copper in them, so they help in electron transfer. Okay, there are also components of enzymes. Some of the enzymes are mentioned here, and plastocyanin is again an electron carrier that is very important in photosynthesis. In case of copper deficiency, there is dieback, meaning the apical meristem, the tips of the growing tips of the branches and the shoot will start dying, and the death progresses then on. That is called dieback. Exanthema, that is the bark starts oozing out a gummy substance, and these are some of the symptoms of copper deficiency. Zinc, a very important thing. Zinc is required for synthesis of a plant growth hormone that is called auxin. So zinc is very important in auxin synthesis, and also it acts as an activator of some of the enzymes. For example, it acts as an activator of dehydrogenase enzymes, you have to remember. And one more enzyme we had learnt, that is alcohol dehydrogenase. This is one of the functions of the essential elements such as zinc. Essential elements play a very important role in activation of some of the enzymes. So it activates an enzyme that is referred to as alcohol dehydrogenase. In case of zinc deficiency, there is little leaf disease that is seen. The leaves which are become very small, and they start exhibiting mottled or yellowed appearance, and then the leaves start collecting together, they become rosetted in nature. Molybdenum, very important in nitrogen metabolism. Molybdenum is a part of two important nitrogen metabolizing enzymes. One is called nitrogenase, one is called nitrate reductase. And you can remember one disease, that is whiptail disease in cauliflower, causing the narrowing of the leaf blades, which is a characteristic symptom of molybdenum deficiency. How exactly are minerals absorbed? Plants absorb minerals obviously from the soil and transfer them to the other parts of the body. Minerals are absorbed in the form of the soil solution. You know that the water in the soil is the storehouse of all the minerals. There are a lot of pore spaces between the soil particles where the root hairs can come in contact with the water that is rich in or dissolved in the minerals. The soil solution contains minerals in what state? In dissolved state. Several theories have been put forth to explain the mechanism of translocation. For example, imagine this is the plant cell, okay? This is the cell wall, and this is the cell membrane of the plant, and this is the vacuole, and this is the nucleus of the plant. Imagine this is the soil. In the soil there are a lot of minerals, okay? So let me put dots, and these are the ions, the mineral ions. Now this is the soil. How is it taken up? It may be passively taken up, or it may be actively taken up. It is said that initially the minerals are taken up, the ions enter this cell wall of the plant cell, which represents the apoplast, the non-living component of the plant cell, which is the apoplast. This uptake of ions to the cell wall is considered to be passive. Once the mineral ions accumulate inside the cell wall, which is completely permeable, they have to now cross the cell membrane and enter into the cytoplasm of the cell. Now this crossing of the cell membrane, that is from apoplast into symplast, it may be active or it may be passive. And this continuous flow of mineral ions is referred to as the flux. Flux. Okay, so remember, initially from the soil the minerals go and accumulate in the space between the cell wall and the cell membrane, because they can readily cross the cell wall. The cell wall is completely permeable to them, and once they accumulate between the cell wall and the cell membrane, they have to cross the cell membrane. This is the cell membrane. They have to cross the cell membrane, and then they have to enter into the cytoplasm. You know that the living component, which includes cytoplasm, and of course there is one more cell next to it, and there is a cell membrane, and there are cytoplasmic connections which exist between them, which is called the plasmodesmata. Now this part of the cell, which includes the living part of the cell, the cytoplasm and the plasmodesmata, is called symplast. So how does it enter the symplast? In order to enter the symplast, it has to cross this barrier which is referred to as the plasma lemma or the plasma membrane, and this is brought about either by passive methods, which does not use any energy, or by active method, which is using energy. However, to enter or to cross the cell wall, this outermost layer is the cell wall, and cell wall is a completely permeable barrier. To cross the cell wall, it does not need any energy at all. Okay, so now let us see passive absorption. How exactly minerals are absorbed directly from the soil without any use of energy. So in this there are two theories of passive absorption. One is called the ion exchange theory. In this slide I am going to talk about ion exchange theory. This first diagram is about contact exchange theory, and the second diagram is about the carbonic acid theory that we will be discussing. Now see, in contact exchange theory, what is happening is, on the surface of the root cell, imagine they have labeled this as the root, consider it as a root cell. This is the cell wall of the root cell. On the surface of the root cell there is H plus ion attached to it. That means it is adsorbed onto it. On the surface of a clay particle that is called the mycel, there is K plus ion. The ions are not stationary. The ions are constantly vibrating to and fro. They are oscillating to and fro. This circle represents the oscillation volume of each of these ions. This is the oscillation volume of H plus, and this is the oscillation volume of K plus. Notice here there is overlapping between the oscillation volumes. When the oscillation volumes overlap, see how K plus, which was on the clay mycel, has moved on to the root surface, and H plus has now made its contact with the clay mycel. See, H plus was earlier adsorbed onto the root, now it is adsorbed onto the clay mycel. K plus was earlier adsorbed onto the mycel, now it is adsorbed onto the root surface. So what happened here? These ions were adsorbed onto the surface of the cell and the surface of the clay particle. They kept vibrating, they kept oscillating. When their oscillations overlapped with each other, they got mutually exchanged. This theory is referred to as the contact exchange theory. Okay, in the second theory that comes under ion exchange theory, which is called carbonic acid theory. Now in the carbonic acid theory, see here, this is the root. The root is giving out carbon dioxide as a byproduct of respiration. Carbon dioxide is dissolving in water to form H2CO3, that is carbonic acid, which splits into H plus and HCO3 minus. The H plus in this HCO3 minus is exchanged for the K plus that is present on, that is adsorbed onto the clay surface. So H plus HCO3 minus gets converted into K plus and HCO3 minus. The proton or the H plus is exchanged for the K plus, and this potassium bicarbonate is absorbed into the root cell. So for this, from the cell, so I am writing it here, if this is the plant cell, this is the protoplast of the cell, and this is the nucleus, and this is the vacuole of the cell. So on the surface of the cell, I mean from inside the cell, what comes out? Carbon dioxide comes out. This carbon dioxide reacts with H2O. This H2O combines with carbon dioxide to form H2CO3. The H2CO3 will now split into H plus and HCO3 minus, and on the surface of the clay particle there is K plus ion adhered onto it, and this K plus is exchanged for the H plus. So H plus HCO3 minus will take up this K plus and it becomes K plus HCO3 minus, and this potassium bicarbonate will now be entering into the cell. That's how potassium is getting delivered into the cell. So remember, the K plus is the one that is adhered onto the clay mycel, and the carbon dioxide is coming out of the root cell. This is called carbonic acid theory. Do you understand? So it forms carbonate ion and H plus ion, bicarbonate ion and H plus ion. The H plus ion is exchanged for the K plus ion on the clay mycel. All this is happening without the use of energy. That's why it is included under passive absorption. There is one more method of mineral translocation that can happen through the cell membrane. I told you that there is a plant cell, there is cell wall, and there is cell membrane. So once the mineral has entered, say for example an ion can directly cross through the cell wall, and now it has entered the space between the cell wall and the cell membrane. Now how is it transferred across the cell membrane? In the cell membrane, if you magnify this portion, in the cell membrane there are special channels, there are special structures which are referred to as the carrier proteins. See, these carrier proteins, they pick up the ions from outside the cell, they turn towards the inside, and they deposit the ions to the inner side of the cell. Okay, so these carrier proteins, these are special membrane proteins, the integral membrane proteins which are present in the plasma membrane of the cell, and their job is nothing but picking up the ions from the outside, rotating by 180 degrees, and depositing those ions back into the inside. This is included under passive absorption. That is because it does not employ any it does not employ any energy in the form of ATP. So where are these carrier proteins present? These carrier proteins, so this outer layer which I showed is the cell wall of the plant, and the inner layer which I showed is the plasma membrane of the plant cell. They are located in the plasma membrane of the root cells, these carrier proteins which carry the ions from the outside to the inside. Okay. There's one more process called Donan equilibrium. Let me consider a plant cell. Imagine inside the plant cell there are fixed anions. So there are anions which are always permanently fixed inside. So let me attach them to the cell membrane to show you that they cannot move out. So let me label these as fixed anions. Now say for example the root cell, this is a root cell. If you imagine this to be a root cell, and if you imagine this to be the soil, so the root cell already in its cytoplasm has certain anions which are fixed in their position, which cannot move out. It is referred to as the fixed anion. Now let us say the soil has two types of ions, cations such as K plus and anions such as Cl minus. Now what will happen if you imagine there are a lot of Cl minus ions, there are a lot of K plus ions on the outside, there are a lot of Cl minus ions. Obviously the concentration of Cl minus ion outside the cell is less, the concentration of outside the cell is more, and the concentration of Cl minus ion inside the cell is very less. So where would you expect the Cl minus to now undergo diffusion? All the chloride ions will now move into the cell from the outside. All these, remember, negatively charged ions are called anions. These are not fixed anions because they are mobile. So these anions will move inside. Now what do you think will happen once these chloride ions will enter inside? The inside will develop a greater negative charge because already there were fixed anions, and now more and more chloride ions have come and collected inside. Now you can imagine they will exert an electrostatic force of attraction, and now who will go inside? These positive ions, because they are being dragged inside by the electrostatic forces of attraction due to the electrical gradients. Now the positive ions will also follow the negative ions. Okay, so this is attraction. This attraction of the K plus ion is referred to as, it is happening because of a gradient that is called the electrical gradient. Okay, now you tell me, why did the chloride ion move inside? The chloride ion moved inside because there was a higher concentration of chloride outside. So was it electrical gradients or was it chemical gradients? It was purely chemical gradients. So this is referred to as the concept of Donan's equilibrium, where there is a fixed number of ions inside the cell. Say for example, there are negatively charged ions which are called anions. Outside the cell there is another species of anion which can freely move, like I gave you the example of chloride. Why is the chloride moving in? Because outside the concentration is high, inside the concentration is low. Once the chloride moves in, already there are fixed anions inside, so the inside, the charge becomes, I am writing here, the inside becomes net negative. The charge inside becomes a net negative, and because there are positive ions sitting outside in the soil, they get attracted due to electrical gradients because of the negative charge inside, and now the positive ions will also flow inside. They will follow the anions, and therefore both anions and cations are successfully absorbed into the root cell. So this is what I called the root cell, isn't it? So successfully first anions were absorbed and then cations were absorbed. The same thing happens if the fixed ions inside are cations, but I have taken the example of the fixed ions being anions. First the anions like chloride will flow in because of the chemical gradients, higher concentration to lower concentration, and then the potassium will follow from less negative to more negative, that is along the electrical gradients. Why did the inside develop a net negative charge? Because lot of anions started pooling up inside. The inside of the cell developed a net negative charge which will electrostatically attract the potassium ions. Okay, now moving on to active absorption. Obviously, active absorption includes the use of metabolic energy in the form of ATP. The first concept under active absorption is carrier concept. It was introduced by Vanden Onert in the year 1937. Now see, this is the plasma membrane of the root cell. This is the outside, that is the soil. So out means it is the soil and inside means it is the cytoplasm. Can you see that there are certain ions outside? These ions are referred to as anions because they are negatively charged ion. Now there are special proteins which are sitting in the plasma membrane which are meant to carry these anions. Now these are referred to as the carrier protein. See how the carrier protein is binding to the anion and then it is turning itself by 180 degrees, and then you can see it is rotating and it is releasing the anion to the inside of the cell. There is an enzyme which helps this protein, this carrier protein, to release the anion. Mostly the enzyme is a phosphatase. Phosphatase enzyme breaks down the complex between the anion and the carrier protein. Now once the anion is released to the cytoplasm of the cell, the carrier precursor now becomes inactive. Now this inactive precursor is made active by an enzyme that is referred to as the kinase enzyme, which will use energy from ATP. So by using energy from ATP, what was negative, as in what was inactive, will now become active. Once the carrier protein is active, again it will flip back to its original position. Again the cycle will repeat. It will turn towards the outside, it will pick up an anion, it will turn back in, it will dissociate in the presence of enzyme phosphatase, it will get activated in the presence of ATP and an enzyme called kinase. That's why, since there is use of ATP, we call this as the active transport mechanism. Okay, protein lecithin as a carrier. Now again, this is outside, this is the soil, and this is inside, this is the cytoplasm, and this is the cell membrane of the root cell. So you have to imagine how an ion is transported from the outside to the inside. There will be a special phospholipid in the plasma membrane that is called lecithin, which has the ability to bind to both anion as well as cation. But it is found towards the outside of the membrane, isn't it? Now it moves towards the inside, and there is an enzyme called lecithinase which will break down the lecithin into phosphatidic acid and choline, and each of these broken down subunits will release the respective ions to the inside of the cell. For example, the phosphatidic acid will release the cation, the choline will release the anion. Did you understand? So for lecithin to be able to release, lecithin is the one that captures the anion and cation from the outside, that is from the soil. For this lecithin to be able to release the anion and cation, should it remain as a lecithin or should it get broken down? It should get broken down in the presence of an enzyme called lecithinase. And what are the products of breakdown? Phosphatidic acid and choline, which are liberating the anion and cation to the inside. This is not it. We need to get back the lecithin. So this is the regeneration process. Can you all see that the process of regeneration consumes energy in the form of ATP? That's why it is nothing but an active process. It is included under an active process because the process where we get back the lecithin molecule from the choline molecule, we need ATP. So energy is consumed in the form of ATP, and that's why this theory of protein lecithin as a carrier put forth by Bennett and Clark in 1956 is included under active transport. Okay. So which is the ion carrier here? It is lecithin. But lecithin can release the ion only when it gets degraded into phosphatidic acid and choline by an enzyme that is referred to as lecithinase. And then the choline will need to be regenerated back into lecithin, for which there is an enzyme, there is requirement of ATP, isn't it? So this is the theory suggested by Bennett and Clark. Cytochrome pump theory. Okay, now in cytochrome pump theory, what happens is we should start from the inside. Again, there is outside, which is the soil. So this is the soil, and this is inside. This is the cytoplasm of the cell, and this whole thing over here is the plasma membrane. Okay. So now we have started with the cytochrome pump theory. There is an electron transport chain inside the plasma membrane. Now let us start from the inside. Inside there will be reactions happening in the cell membrane called dehydrogenase reactions. These dehydrogenase reactions will liberate two things. One is electron and one is proton. Let us now come to the proton later. Let us see what happens to this electron. The electron is picked up by Fe3 plus molecule. Now this Fe3 plus, you remember that Fe3 plus is the oxidized state. If it picks up an electron, it gets reduced into Fe2 plus. Okay, so now this Fe3 plus will take this electron, it will itself get converted into Fe2 plus, and it will now transfer the electron to the next Fe3 plus, which will now get reduced into Fe2 plus, and now this Fe2 plus will give away the electron to the next Fe3 plus. So totally there are 3 Fe3 pluses which are present in the cell membrane. See what happens was, let me show it in simple format here. We started with a Fe3 plus. The Fe3 plus took the electron. Now this Fe3 plus, it took up the electron. Because it took up an electron, what happened to it? It became Fe2 plus. Now this Fe2 plus is giving the electron to the neighboring Fe3 plus. Now the neighboring Fe3 plus will take this electron from Fe2 plus and it will become Fe2 plus. But this Fe2 plus, which gave away the electron, will come back to becoming the Fe3 plus. Now this Fe2 plus will give out its electron to the neighboring Fe3 plus. The neighboring Fe3 plus will take up the electron and it will become what? Fe2 plus. but this Fe2 plus which has now given the electron will come back to being Fe3 plus. So it is somewhat like this. You have to remember there are 3 Fe3 plus molecules, 1 and 2 and 3. They periodically change between Fe3 plus and Fe2 plus. How did the first Fe3 plus molecule become Fe2 plus? By taking up electron from the dehydrogenation reaction, and then it become Fe2 plus. Fe2 plus passes on the electron to the neighboring Fe3 plus, which becomes Fe2 plus. Now this Fe2 plus passes on the electron to the next neighboring Fe3 plus, which gets reduced into Fe2 plus. What happens to this final Fe2 plus? Now this final Fe2 plus, what it will do is it will take up an anion. So I'm going to put a minus sign here. It takes up an anion, okay, and it gives away its electron. So when it takes up an anion and when it gives away an electron, it will no longer be Fe2 plus. It will now become Fe3 plus. But what is attached to this Fe3 plus? An anion is attached. See, this Fe3 plus, this anion is accepted by the Fe2 plus, and now you can see this particular Fe3 plus, it is attached to an anion to its side. So the last Fe2 plus gets converted into Fe3 plus by taking up an anion and by giving out an electron. Is that clear? Now what will happen to this Fe3 plus? The Fe3 plus will carry this anion. Again it goes towards the surface, the inner side of the cell membrane. It carries this anion, and finally you can see here it is getting oxidized. It is getting reduced into Fe2 plus, and it is giving away this anion, and the anion is released into the cell cytoplasm. It took this anion from the outer side, that is from the soil, and it combined with that anion in the form of Fe3 plus. It took all the way into the cell, and here finally it gave away the anion back into the cytoplasm. Okay, so remember there are Fe3 plus molecules which are periodically getting oxidized by giving away electron. The last Fe2 plus molecule in the cell membrane towards the outer surface of the cell membrane will get oxidized into Fe3 plus by picking up an anion and by giving out the electron. The electron which is given out by Fe3 plus will combine with this H plus that we got in the inner surface in order to form water molecule. Okay, so this is slightly confusing, so go through it once again. You will get a clear picture of how this Fe2 plus Fe3 plus change is happening. What is very important is this step, that is the reduction of Fe3 plus into Fe2 plus on the inner surface, and this step, that is oxidation of Fe2 plus into Fe3 plus by giving away the electron, which is happening on the outer surface of the membrane. Because it gives away the electron, it can take up the anion and it becomes Fe3 plus bound to an anion. This Fe3 plus bound to an anion will transfer the anion throughout the electron chain, and it will finally, the anion will reach the inner surface of the membrane and it is released into the cytoplasm. Translocation of mineral ions. Obviously, once the mineral ions, usually they pass through the xylem and they are translocated through the transpiration pull. Now let us only come to the important parts of this chapter which are remaining. The nitrogen cycle. So you all are aware about the three major pools of nitrogen. One is the atmospheric nitrogen, one is the nitrogen that is present in the soil, and one is the dead and decaying organic matter. So you should remember that there are biological nitrogen fixers which can convert nitrogen into ammonia, which can reduce nitrogen into ammonia. Industrial nitrogen fixation like thermal power plants, industrial combustion that can convert nitrogen into ammonia. Electrical nitrogen fixation like lightning and UV rays can convert the atmospheric nitrogen, about 78% of the atmospheric nitrogen. Some of it is converted into nitrate, that is NO3 minus, and sometimes the nitrate that is present in the soil, it can get reduced into nitrogen, and this process where nitrate in the soil is given back into the atmosphere is referred to as denitrification. Okay, very important thing is it is this nitrate that is made available to the plants. The plants take up this nitrate, and then when the plant dies, the plant is fed by the animals, and when the animal also dies and the plant also dies, we have the dead and decaying organic matter of the plant and animal, in which we have nitrogen in the form of NH2. This nitrogen NH2, that is organic nitrogen, is reduced into ammonia. Okay, this nitrogen is reduced into ammonia, and this process where it is reduced into ammonia is referred to as ammonification. Okay, the process where it is reduced into ammonia, and remember this NH2 that is associated with the dead and decaying organic matter is considered as the organic nitrogen. Now what happens to the ammonia that is entering into the soil? As you can see here, this part of the reaction, ammonia is getting oxidized into nitrite NO2 minus, which is getting oxidized into nitrate NO3 minus. The bacteria involved in oxidation of ammonia to nitrate is, for example, you have Nitrosomonas and you have Nitrococcus. And the enzyme involved in oxidation of nitrite into nitrate is referred to as the nitrobacter. These reactions where in the soil ammonia from the dead and decaying organic matter through the process of ammonification, which is converted all the way into nitrate, is referred to as the nitrification process. And finally, which is the nitrogen that is made available to the plants? It is nitrate. So nitrate is taken up by the plants, and in the plants what happens is the nitrate is converted into ammonia again, but this ammonia is stored in the form of, it is protonated into NH4 plus, which is ammonium ion. Ammonium ion. So remember, nitrate is reduced into ammonia in the plant, and it is immediately protonated in physiological pH, and it is stored. It is very toxic, so it is quickly incorporated into amino acids. We will be seeing later what is the fate of this ammonia. So it is very important that the major part that is made available to the plant is nitrate. The nitrate is reduced into ammonia, and it is present in the form of organic nitrogen, which is in the form of NH2, that is reduced into NH3, isn't it? Now this NH3 is the conversion of this NH2, that is organic nitrogen NH2, which is reduced into ammonia, that is present in the soil. Now this is basically present in the decaying matter, which is mentioned here. It is the decaying biomass. The ammonia in the decaying biomass is converted to ammonia finally in the soil. This process is referred to as ammonification. It is a reduction process. Remember, it is a reduction process, and all these processes which I spoke of over here, these are all oxidation processes. Ammonia is oxidized into nitrite, and nitrite is oxidized into nitrate. So these bacteria which carry out the oxidation processes we are talking about here, that is Nitrosomonas carries out oxidation of ammonia to nitrate, and Nitrobacter carries out oxidation of nitrite to nitrate. These are all chemosynthetic or chemoautotrophic bacteria. What do you mean by chemoautotrophic bacteria? They can make their own food. That's why they are called autotrophic. They are called chemo because they are mostly involved in oxidation reaction, and they derive energy from oxidation reaction. So by carrying out oxidation of mineral components, they derive energy which is going to be used for the process of making food from the atmospheric carbon dioxide. So they don't get energy from the sunlight, they get energy from oxidation processes, and this process and such bacteria which derive energy by oxidation processes are referred to as chemoautotrophic or chemosynthetic. So it's very important, whatever is happening in the soil is given in this red colored sphere, and this is very very important. The main oxidation processes which occur in the soil, where ammonia is oxidized into nitrite and nitrite is oxidized into nitrate. Okay. Now, nitrogen fixation, that is, we were discussing about the nitrogen that is present in the atmosphere. We saw how the nitrogen in the atmosphere through industrial combustion or thermal power plants or power generating station, it can be converted into ammonia, or we saw how thunder, lightning, UV rays can convert it into oxides of nitrogen. But now we are going to see how this nitrogen that is present in the air, that is the atmosphere, is going to get converted into ammonia in the plant body. That means the plants are able to carry out nitrogen fixation. When I say that the plants are able to carry out nitrogen fixation, they are going to capture, not exactly they, you will come to know who, the capturing of nitrogen. See, nitrogen is in the form of two nitrogen atoms which are held tightly by three covalent bonds. You can see three bonds are there between them. This nitrogen is converted into ammonia, that is by an enzyme called nitrogenase, and this is done not by the plant but by a bacteria which is living inside the root of the plant. It is called rhizobium. Rhizobium is a bacteria that is found in leguminous plants. So find out what are the examples mentioned in your textbook for leguminous plants. Like there is alfalfa, there is sweet clover, there is clover bean, broad bean, garden pea, sweet pea, lentil. All these leguminous plants, they have this anaerobic bacteria that is called rhizobium, which is a symbiotic bacteria. But when they are free living, they don't fix nitrogen, they are aerobic. But only when they become associated with the plant body, they are capable of fixing nitrogen. There is one more bacteria which can do this job of converting the atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia and making it available to the plant, and this job is done by a bacteria called Frankia, which is seen in non-leguminous plants. Now an example for a non-leguminous plant, if you remember or if you go through your NCERT, you will see that there is mention of a plant called Alnus. Alnus is an example for a non-leguminous plant where you can see Frankia which fixes nitrogen for the plant. Why is this being done? Why is nitrogen getting converted to ammonia? Because the plant needs ammonia. The plant needs nitrogen in the form of ammonia. So this ammonia is supplied to the plant. Okay. Where is this process happening? This process is happening in specialized structures which are referred to as the root nodules. And how are the root nodules formed in the leguminous plants and in the case of non-leguminous plants like Alnus? Now see, this is the root of the plant. You can see the root hair. These are the cells of the outermost layer of the plant root which help in absorption of water. These are called as root hair. Then you have soil particle, and inside the soil you have these tiny bacteria. Which are these bacteria here? We are considering the bacteria that we are focusing now on, the rhizobium bacterium, which is symbiotic, and when it is symbiotic it is aerobic and it is anaerobic, and it can fix nitrogen to the plant. See how the bacteria is infecting the root hair. The root hair becomes like a shepherd's stick. It becomes curved like this. Okay. And then the bacteria, they form an infection thread. See how the bacteria are penetrating into the root. They reach the cells of the cortex. This is the cortical region of the root. And once the bacteria start infecting the cells, the mass of infected cells becomes something referred to as the mature nodule. Now let us take one cell from this nodule and see how the bacteria are present. If this is the cell, that is, I have taken from the mature nodule, inside the cell you will find vesicles. These vesicles will contain groups of bacteria in them, And these clusters of bacteria which are present inside these vesicles are referred to as the bacteroids. Okay, so once the bacteria affects, so this is the plant cell, let us say the cell, the host cell, let me call it the cell of the cortex, and then you can see these are the vesicles. Inside the vesicles you can see, for example, let me magnify the vesicle for you here. If this is the vesicle, there will be groups of nitrogen fixing bacteria, and these groups of bacteria sitting inside the vesicles are referred to as the bacteroids. And these are the bacteroids which are the nitrogen fixing bacteria that sit inside the root, and they start making ammonia from nitrogen. Another important thing, there is a bacteroid here. So these are the clusters of bacterial cells, and there is a limiting membrane you can see, and the entire membrane outside, it has a special pigment. The pigment is referred to as the leg hemoglobin, and this leg hemoglobin will not allow oxygen to enter into the vesicle, because if oxygen enters, then the enzyme present in these bacteria called nitrogenase enzyme, see, this is the enzyme, it is a molybdenum iron containing enzyme which is very very important in nitrogen fixation. So these bacteroids, they contain this enzyme called nitrogenase, which cannot function if oxygen enters. Who keeps the oxygen away from these vesicles? There is a pigment, a pink colored pigment that you can see surrounding these bacteroid, these vesicles, which is referred to as the leg hemoglobin. So if you cut open a mature nodule, the nodule appears pink in color because of this pink colored pigment, which helps in getting rid of oxygen, or it takes away all the oxygen. It absorbs every last bit of oxygen in the surrounding area, and that's why we can call this pigment as the oxygen scavenger. Okay, how exactly does the enzyme, now in the rhizobium I told you there is an enzyme called nitrogenase. Notice what it does. This enzyme has an active site. See, there is a two clefted structure here, which is the active site to which the nitrogen gas is binding from the atmosphere. So now the nitrogen gas goes and binds onto this active site. The name of the enzyme present in the rhizobium, the bacteria which is sitting inside the root nodule, I told you that if this is the cell of the plant cell, root cell, or we called it as host cell, if this is the cell of the plant, in the plant cell there will be vesicles. Yes, in the vesicles there will be aggregations of bacteria, and these vesicles are provided with a pigment on the outside which are called the leg hemoglobin. So plant cell, this is the cytoplasm of the plant cell. I have not shown the nucleus and the vacuole and all that. These are the vesicles which are formed by the infecting rhizobia, and inside there are clusters of rhizobia that are called the bacteroids, and these rhizobia contain an enzyme called nitrogenase. So it binds to nitrogen, it takes up 2 protons and 2 electrons, or 2 hydrogen atoms. Okay, hydrogen, 2 hydrogen means 2 proton and 2 electron. So first it takes up 2 hydrogen, and each hydrogen, as you can see, is bound to the nitrogen, that is reduction takes place. Then the next step of reduction is again another 2 hydrogen enter, so 2 more hydrogens are added to the nitrogen. So now each nitrogen, so in the first step we had 1 nitrogen here connected by 3 bonds to the neighboring nitrogen. In the first step 1 hydrogen was added, by taking up how many hydrogens? 2. In the second step 2 more are taken, that means you again have the nitrogen connected by 3 bonds to the next nitrogen. Now each one is, instead of 1 hydrogen, is bound by 2 hydrogen molecules, 2 hydrogen atoms, and additional 2 was taken in. Now in the third step another 2 hydrogen molecules are taken. See here, so in the third step what happens is, again you have nitrogen 3 bonds with another nitrogen, but now instead of 3 hydrogens, instead of 2 hydrogens, you have 1 hydrogen extra, so it is NH3 NH3. And as this happens, I forgot to mention the number of bonds will decrease to fit the valency of, so here it becomes a single bond, isn't it? So 2 hydrogen, here it is a single bond, and here also there is no bond between the nitrogen at all. So ultimately you get how many molecules of ammonia? This is 1 molecule of NH3 and this is 1 molecule of NH3. So you end up with 2 molecules of NH3, and for all this process how many ATP molecules are used? 16 ATP molecules are employed. Okay, so here there should be a double bond to suit the valency of nitrogen. So what was triple bond will now get reduced into a double bond structure. Is that clear? So one of the electron is shared with hydrogen now. As a result, what happens now is the triple bond becomes a double bond, and then it becomes a single bond, and then when 3 hydrogens are added, there is no triple bond anymore between the nitrogen. So the 2 nitrogens split and they now become NH3, NH3. And now see, the enzyme is free again. Again the enzyme will go back to the first step, and again it will bind to nitrogen molecule, and the same process will be carried forward again. So this equation is important. We used up a total of how many H plus? 1 2 3 4 5 6 hydrogen atoms are used. So here they have given 8, that is 8 protons and 8 electrons, which make up 8 hydrogen. You're getting a byproduct of 2 hydrogens back over here. So actually out of 8, how many got used up? Only 6 got used up. And how many ATP molecules are getting used up over here? We are using up 16 ATP molecules that are broken down into 16 ADP and 16 PI. So this is a very, very energy consuming, energy demanding process. Clear? What happens to this ammonia? So our goal is clear now. Nitrogen is finally obtained in the form of ammonia. So the plant has received ammonia thanks to this symbiotic nitrogen fixing bacteria. This ammonia will be protonated in the form of NH4. I told you ammonia will pick up a proton in the plants and it will get converted into NH4 plus. But NH4 plus is very toxic to the plant body. So either it is subjected to reductive amination, where NH4 gets added onto an acid called alpha ketoglutaric acid, and it synthesizes an amino acid that is called glutamic acid, or the NH4 gets incorporated into an amino acid. See, there is a NH3 plus molecule here. It has now become a part of, it gets deprotonated, and in the form of NH3 plus it gets converted, it becomes a part of the amino acid. Sometimes the NH3 plus from amino acid gets transferred onto a keto acid. Now this is keto acid 2, this is amino acid 1. Amino acid 1 and keto acid 2, now it's converted to keto acid 1 and amino acid 2. That's because this amino group made its way from R1, that is from the first amino acid, to the keto acid, that is R2. Okay, so this is how from one molecule to another molecule the amino group is being transferred, and these are the reactions which help in which take care of the ammonia once it is made its way into the plant body. So with this we complete the synopsis of the chapter Mineral Nutrition. Thank you.